Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, the debate over medical marijuana has dominated headlines throughout the year. What brought this issue to the forefront of Utah politics? How did opposition groups work against the initiative? And what explains the change in views over time? After the election, Utah's legislature convened to pass a compromise bill. In what ways does the new law differ from the initiative? How will the policies affect our state? And moving forward, what is next in line for medical marijuana in Utah?
Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Representative Brian King, House Minority Leader, Julia Ritchey, political reporter with KUER, and Representative Greg Hughes, Speaker of the House. So glad to have you here for a very special edition of the Hinckley Report talking about Proposition 2 and how it became law just this past week. Speaker Hughes, we're going to start with you.
Yes.
The bill that came out was a product of a compromise. It was reached even before the votes were taken on Proposition 2, and stuff happened after that as well. Please talk about how we got to the compromise and how it made it into this bill.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity because I think there's a lot of discussion about what the agreement is versus what Proposition 2 was, and I think that it's a lot closer than people might have been told or that they're hearing. Late summer, the campaign started to wind up for Prop 2 as well as against Prop 2. But one of the things that I was hearing as a policymaker and as a public servant, and been in public service in the legislature for 16 years, I heard some common ground that I had not heard in the years prior about medical cannabis and its role with the state of Utah or with patients. You heard from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that they actually would support or do support medical cannabis if it was administered with the supervision of a doctor or a physician and in a dosable form. And I heard that, and it surprised me, but there wasn't a lot of attention being paid to that. People were still kind of talking or speaking past one another, but I heard common ground, and so I asked those that had sponsored the bill, drafted Prop 2, marshaled the signatures, and were running the campaign to meet with me, as well as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in separate meetings, and those that were opposed to Prop 2, to try and see if there really was this common ground. It, in fact, did exist, and so it was I always qualified it as a low percentage chance that you could bring people together, but that is exactly what happened from the end of August until the announcement on October 4th. There really was a coming together. I hesitate to call it a compromise because some people think that's a retreating of a position or cutting the baby in half. This is an agreement, and what I mean by that is I don't think there was any retreat. I think you have a medical cannabis program through this agreement that is structurally and politically so much stronger than what the proposition was. And we wanted to fully inform the voters. So this is why on October 4th you saw such a rollout and a very public pronouncement that whether Prop 2 passed or not, we were going to move forward with this agreement that was comprehensive with all sides. And if that had been on the ballot, if this agreement had been on the ballot, you wouldn't have seen a 52-48 vote. You would have seen over 70% or more. Because we were all coming together.
Mm-hmm. Here's my concern about this, Jason, and that is the proposition got on the ballot after this long process to get the initiative, to gather the signatures for the initiative. We at the legislature have made it very difficult for Utahns to express their will through the initiative process. We've increased the number of signatures that have to be gathered. We've increased the number of locations that they have to be gathered from. The folks who were behind Prop 2 spent months, even years, working on this, and they spent thousands and thousands of hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars. They make it, they get over the barriers, they get it on the ballot, momentum is building for it, and the troubling thing from my perspective is interfering in that process in an effort to find common ground. And I don't fault the Speaker, I don't question his good faith at all, but what this was basically saying to the people of the state of Utah who'd worked so hard to get Prop 2 on the ballot, thanks very much for your efforts, we'll take it from here.
Okay, what's the problem? The timing on when that compromise came?
Part of it was
is that
the
the
timing.
argument
Part
as
of it was
opposed to
timing.
doing a compromise at all?
No, I don't think doing a compromise at all was a problem, but I think the timing of it made people suspicious. That's my concern. And like I say, I don't fault the speaker at all, but what I'm saying is it's hard to avoid the whiff of interference and overbearing behavior on the part of some of the power players in the state on this.
But I have to jump in for a sec. This is what we have to make sure that the viewing audience understands. If you built this in a silo of people that only opposed Prop 2, then what Representative King said it would be the case. When we talk about they, the people that work so hard to bring this forward, we're talking about bringing people into the room together who literally authored the Proposition 2 language, the people that organized the gathering of the signatures, who were collecting and getting the campaign funds and running the campaign for Prop 2. We are not canceling out their work. They are coming together with this agreement. There's this narrative out there that we're robots for a faith and that we're just doing as instructed. This was really coming together in a unique way. This is, and I give full credit to the initiative. This wasn't a wasted effort. We, by the end of the summer, we're not talking if Prop 2 or patient access to medical cannabis would happen or not. We were coming together to say how would that happen, and that is a victory because I don't think if the Proposition 2 wasn't there and we weren't feeling or seeing that public sentiment as strong as it was, I don't think you see this agreement. So this is an initiative that saw its success by late summer, which is everyone should see it for what it is, a success.
I do think there is a fundamental misunderstanding that the Utah legislature does have the power to alter any initiative that goes before voters. And because we've never had this many initiatives, I think a lot of voters took for granted that things that pass, on the ballot are going to just go into law and not have any go back and tweak it or anything. So I think everyone was on the same page that this initiative was going to have to be altered in some way. It was just the amount that it was going to be altered. That was the question, and that's a political reality that I think some of the backers of Prop 2, including Connor Boyack from the Libertas Institute, helped write the law, saw when he saw the poll numbers dropping, and I think he wanted to have a seat at the table. That, quite frankly, he might not have if they had just let it go before voters and then had to go and beg Speaker Hughes or other political players to do it.
It's a really good point.
Yeah, Julie, I take this point a little further then. So with the comments we've just had, if a compromise had not been reached even before the vote, based on your many, many interviews with people, do you have a sense of whether or not Prop 2 would have even passed if that had not already been something that was worked out?
I think Connor's been very forthright about seeing poll numbers, internal poll numbers that they did beforehand that made them worry that there was enough resistance among very devout members of the LDS Church that could have sunk the proposition. Although, having gone to the polls and interviewed voters, I think Prop 2 was the main driver for this past election.
Are we tied? When we lived through the meal of Ben McAdams' congressional race, and we look at the dollars that were spent and the tone of that campaign, what we avoided as a state was more than $2 million of media buys with what I thought were incorrect or inaccurate narratives on both sides. I did not believe that those that had an opposition to Prop 2 had a callousness or didn't care about people that were suffering. I thought that was not correct. But I also did not believe that those that believed and were supporting Prop 2 wanted to turn this state into a haze of marijuana smoke and that it was the beginning of the end. These were the narratives, and we never really saw those campaigns. These media buys were canceled. There was more than $2 million that would have been pummeling our families, our neighborhoods with these inaccurate stories or storylines. And I think it would have had its cost. And so I think coming together and finding an agreement the way we did, I think it spared us of a lot of carnage that could have come from a contentious election cycle.
I do think that there is a lot of good that came out of the bill that we passed in the special session last week. And there are ways in which it makes access to medical cannabis very real in a way that Prop 2 was wanting to do and that Prop 2 would have done. And there are some aspects of Prop 2 that weren't good that we got rid of. But there are some aspects of Prop 2 that I liked that aren't in the new bill that we passed. And for example, we narrowed significantly the conditions for which, the diagnoses for which you could prescribe medical marijuana. We reduced the number of locations that marijuana would be distributed from. And there were some other things that well, there's no renter protection, for example, and we could talk about the details of those, and the Speaker and I have done that, and it's not really what we can get into here, I think, with our time. But what I would say is this was a lot more nuanced than people gave it credit for. And one of the things that made it hard for me, I voted no on this because I thought it was just the timing and the process were too difficult for me to overcome. 75% of my constituents in House District 28 voted for Prop 2. And I just thought it smacked too much of arrogance and condescension and we know better than you to the voters for us to go in and less than 30 days later pass something that was quite different in many ways, better in some ways, but it was a hard thing for me to get around the optics of that.
I think the mistrust, though, has been building over the years, and that's something that's a lot harder to address. Is you haven't addressed medical marijuana. It has been 4 years. Like, why should we wait for the special session for them to come to this when they've had years to work on that? And that's something I think you have had a difficult time articulating too about the slow process of the legislative.
It is not intuitive for a legislative body to deem something medicine or not. That's something that we don't typically do. And also in this gray area, but there is strength in numbers. We have over 30 states now that have done it. But looking to circumvent federal law is not really a bill or a way that we usually move forward. And so there has been that trepidation or that concern about what we were dealing with. It's outside of what a legislative body typically does. But we have a lot of states where there was a good example. And I think that the initiative brought the realities in front of us. And we, as public servants, needed to respond appropriately.
I want to get to the federal regulation piece in just a moment, but maybe let's touch on this theme. There's a lawsuit that has been filed, claiming this is something you were talking about, Representative, saying this is interfering with the power of the people and what they wanted to have happen. Is that the essence of this case? Is it more about the process or is it about the actual results of it?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? I mean, you've got three P's here going on. You've got policy, process, and politics. The politics were hard to get by in terms of how do you explain to the people of the state of Utah, who, as in my district, overwhelmingly voted for Prop 2. Yeah, we'll take it from here less than 30 days later and change the Prop 2 significantly. That was hard. The process, though, is the other thing that I think gives people pause, and that is you have people coming together within about 30 days of the election saying, we're going to throw a wrench into the works in terms of how people vote and how they think about Prop 2 as they go to the ballot box. And you can say that was an effort to find common ground. I think that's true. I think the Speaker and those who were in favor of Prop 2, as Julia mentioned, Connor Boyack and some of the other folks who were in favor were concerned, hey, look, if we don't strike a compromise, this thing could go down and we could have some real problems. That's all true. But for the average Utah voter, they don't get that. And it's a hard thing to go in from a political perspective and an optics perspective and within 30 days say, nah, we're going to set aside what you did.
Speaker, what do you say to those people who come and say, hey, this was our voice and...
Here's the lawsuit really centers around whether the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints interfered and dominated the process that we went through. The facts won't bear that out. We have players, as we do, in terms of stakeholders, voices. You're bringing people together. There wasn't. As a lawmaker, I'm not a robot for anyone, and I have a voting record over 16 years. I think that shows that I will work as a public servant and make those decisions that I feel are important. And there are no instructions or marching orders that are handed to me. I think that the crux of the lawsuit would suggest that that is what happened there. It ignores the kind of collaboration that occurred. And what I would say to the public at large is you have different reasons why people voted yes or no. Once you knew that if it failed, we were going to move forward with a medical cannabis program. If it passed, we were, because we were putting something that we thought was, again, structurally and politically stronger. People could have easily, with that information, have said, I want, and I heard this, I support the agreement, but I'm going to vote for Prop 2 to make sure we hold the legislature and the governor's feet to the fire. There are some that said, I don't really have to vote for Prop 2 now because they've represented that they're going to move forward with this. Once you don't know, and I'm not saying I can discern the motivations of voters, but I'm saying the critics can't either. You can't say that there is a clear, bright line between why people voted for or against Prop 2. Once people began coming together finding an agreement and then being very transparent about that and telling the public at large what work was going on. So I don't think it's a violation of the public trust when we go in, because we were going to have to. And one of the things my daughter gets after me about, that I talked to her when we talked around the kitchen table about what is wrong with Prop 2. She says, you never say this. Let me just say, the biggest problem with Prop 2 was what they call the affirmative defense. In plain English, Prop 2 would have meant that the assumption with law enforcement was the possession of marijuana was for medical reasons. That was the assumption. And with that assumption, law enforcement, the chiefs of police, the sheriffs, even the DEA said, that is just such a large, such a large assumption that we won't enforce marijuana possession laws at that point, because if you're found in possession, as long as you could find a malady or someone after the fact, a doctor that would say, yeah, you would fit some of these terms, which some of them are vague, it just meant that we were really going to get recreational if we had Prop 2 without any changes. And look, these propositions in any state that has seen them through voter initiative, there isn't an occasion where the legislature hasn't had to come in, because it becomes law, and look at that statute and look at that law and make some tweaks. And so it was identified correctly that we would have done that. Why would we do that in a silo and not together? So I just think the lawsuit, I think it's pageantry. I think it's I think it's not going to stand up to the
I will disagree with one point, which is the criticism against the church is a subgenre of a larger concern about special interest influence on the legislature. There are 500 lobbyists up at the Capitol every winter session. We found out a couple years ago when the legislature passed a resolution supporting shrinking Bears Ears, it was written by a lobbyist at the Sutherland Institute. So legislators are not writing these bills. In large part, they're written by lobbyists, they're written by other people. They might align with that lawmaker's views and perhaps their constituents' views, but there is that concern that normal people don't have a seat at the table. And in that sense, the initiative process is a very positive development in Utah politics, in that it does give a larger voice to a larger number of people than what normally is a political reality, where you do have to bring a few representatives to the table. You can't have everyone in a room.
I think that's absolutely true. We would not have seen what happened last week in the special session but for that initiative passing. Not just for it existing, but for it passing. And this is where the Speaker and I may disagree a little bit. I think it made a world of difference that this thing, Prop 2, was voted up 53-47. If it had been voted down 53-47, I think you would have had much greater pressure on the part of lawmakers, particularly Republican and conservative lawmakers, to say, hey, the will of the people argument is something that now resonates with me. I don't think we should have legalized marijuana, medical cannabis at all.
I actually agree with that sentiment.
You think that would be the case?
I have been shocked that there was this selective memory. I mean, I thought that we had been so public about us moving forward with this program, whether Prop 2 passed or if it failed. People were so they assumed that the Prop 2 meant that they didn't want the agreement, that had the other side prevailed. And had it failed, I would have been the same guy saying, we have this agreement that we've all agreed to, and I would be making the same case. But if that logic was applied to the other side, saying, no, we don't want this anymore because it didn't pass, that would have been an incredibly challenging hurdle. And so, in some ways, I agree with Representative King that when that vote outcome happened, people have made broad assumptions and narratives have flown that are contrary to what we were saying prior to Election Day. And I will say this: we talk about those meetings where you have to draft legislation and how that works. I would argue, and if you ask Connor Boyack, who wrote Prop 2 language, he would tell you that the agreement and how we were bringing stakeholders together and the informal and formal hearings we had was far more transparent and collaborative than when he sat in his office and wrote Prop 2. That did not have the kind of collaboration or participation broadly that the agreement has had. And so I think that I give the initiative its full credit that it deserves, that it is why we have an agreement.
Representative?
It's not, the transparency is just not with the initiative and not with the legislative process.
Okay, I think we have to note the vote was not unanimous.
Right.
All right. The Democrats had some other approaches, and you in particular voted against it.
Right. I voted against it largely because I thought it disrespected the process of the initiative that we'd gone through. I didn't understand this, Jason. I thought that the Speaker's efforts to find common ground were great and that there was much accomplished. And we, as a Democratic caucus, had a public hearing, an informal hearing. It wasn't strictly within the formal legislative process. But the Speaker came, to his credit. I appreciated that. We had dozens of people who came and testified. He testified and talked about the bill. He stayed the entire time. It was a 3 or 4 hour hearing, and there was much good information that came from that resulted in changes to the bill that was ultimately passed. We had a formal hearing before the Interim Health and Human Services Committee. That was a 5 or a 6 hour.
It started at 3 p.m., ended at 8:30.
Yeah, and the Speaker was there the entire time. He gets props from me for that. So there was a process that came after the election, particularly, that I thought really improved that bill. But I still didn't understand. It still struck me as disrespecting the process to immediately run in and say, we want to change this. I didn't understand why we couldn't wait until the 2019 session. I think we could have done better with it that way.
Yes, you would have waited for that.
I think so.
For this.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think there's not, I mean, Senator Anderegg, I think, made a really good point about this, which is that this is going to be the new alcohol bill every year, that we're going to see a marijuana bill year after year, because there are going to be a lot of details that just are going to have to be worked out as this unroll, as they unroll.
And I agree with that.
So people are already asking me that too. So you think that's right? They say we're going to see more changes during this legislative session.
No,
I think
you'll see more changes.
I hope not.
I mean, look, I think it's so complex. It's such a big area of law. I don't see how we can, say something last week about what medical marijuana is going to look like in Utah and then not have it change for a few months. Now, I don't think it's going to be big changes, but I, for one, would like to see renter protection in there. I'd like to see tenants given more protection from landlords evicting them just because they hold a marijuana card.
Let's just do this. Part of trying to get together and put a system together, understanding that it's something brand new, we didn't want to have people in their own silos, or we didn't want to just have the annual fight that we've seen for the last 4 sessions or more. We need to come together minimally for 1 session. I don't know how you change something that you haven't really rolled out yet. Now, by the way, we do have, if you take a patient that needs medical cannabis in the state of Utah, if you have a physician who would recommend it, and you can find it, and you can in surrounding states in a dosable form, you can get that today with the passage of the bill. Some people don't know that. In the year 2020, that's when the licenses will be issued. That's when the program rolls out for the state of Utah in the year 2020. We need to spend this next year coming together, building this, making sure it's what we've represented it would be. In that effort, in the 2020 session or some other time, there will certainly be those issues that you need to tweak. But if we just start chipping away at something we haven't even begun implementing yet, I think one of the motivations of coming together was to avoid that, to have some quiet, to just finally see all sides come together in a collective effort.
Okay. Representative, the federal law is not settled on this, right? Under the Obama administration, there were some memos that were sort of not putting forward enforcement efforts or putting those down. Some of those have gone away, and maybe the new administration is looking at how are your bodies, I want to hear, approaching this issue where we have just passed something. We're in company with 31 other states, as we've just found out, but still, we had that federal issue lingering.
Oh, it's a big issue, and we don't really know what to do with it. I think we take some comfort, as the Speaker said, in the fact that over 30 states have passed medical marijuana themselves, and a number of other states, probably getting close to a dozen, have passed recreational marijuana. So you would think that if the feds are going to do anything, the window for them to do that is either closed or that is rapidly closing, simply because it's too big an animal to try and put back into its cage at the state level. I would also think that they would pursue somebody pursuing recreational marijuana, a state pursuing recreational marijuana first before they go after a state pursuing medicinal cannabis, medical cannabis. So we take some comfort in that, but we also, quite honestly, have given up the feeling that existed maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago that, well, no, we're precluded from acting because of federal law. I think more and more people in the body, and both the Senate and the House, have said, you know what, we're just going to go ahead with this because we can't, the federal inaction, the federal inertia is so damaging in terms of how people feel in their actual lives and what they need in their actual lives. We can't just wait for them any longer.
Your body on the Republican side of the aisle took some comfort in that fact. We're down the road a bit. It's not recreational.
Well, it goes to the point of why we didn't proactively violate federal law as a legislative body. When you see an initiative, Proposition 2, coming that would just basically attempt to do this in a way that I saw plenty, as we've discussed, unintended consequences, it really raises the stakes. We as a state have done our best, our level best, to create protections for the public, to not undermine public safety in the atmosphere that we're in. I would love for the federal government to either reschedule cannabis and have it so that it can be accessed in a pharmacy and that it's not in this gray area. I would love for them to either change the law, enforce the law, but in the absence and the chaos that's been created of doing nothing, and with these initiatives in states going forward, it was incumbent upon us. We had to put our best effort to protect the public, to not undermine public safety. If the federal government wants to decide and have an epiphany one day that they want to enforce the Controlled Substance Act, I agree with Representative King. I think recreational marijuana it violates it at a much greater length than a state that's earnestly trying to really get its hands around an issue that I think has been foisted on us by the federal inaction.
I think until you have a democratically controlled Congress, we have a House now, you won't see that happen. Senator Chuck Schumer has a bill that would actually do that, but this has become too much of a divisive issue for both parties to really come together on a host of issues. Mm-hmm. But I could see it being a really big issue in like the 2020 presidential race. Based on your interviews with people throughout the state, one or two things they're looking for in this bill that they feel were big wins? Basically, what was one with the qualifying patients, making sure that PTSD diagnoses are protected, and that there are triggers in this bill to open more pharmacies if the state cannot open up its central fill in a number of times. So the framework of Prop 2 is all in this compromise. Robert Gerke of the Salt Lake Tribune said there's a lot to like about this bill. So it's the devil's in the details, I guess.
That's right.
One thing you're looking forward to with this bill going forward, do you think was the biggest success?
I'll tell you this: you had people. If you came into some of these, it's been problem solving. That's what we're trying to do. It's this balance of you don't want to undermine public safety, but you can't regulate it to death where you're not going to have the public the public access. What I'm excited about is that you've heard a combined sentiment from our state departments of health, agriculture. You've had the legislative body and the advocates coming together to solve the problem. That's what's exciting.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for your insights. Well, that's it for this week. Join us next Friday for another edition of the Hinckley Report. Thank you and good night.